On a cold morning in March 2002, locals from a quiet town near Bremen were taking apart the old garage of a deceased priest, Father Robert. Under a layer of heavy, dusty tarpaulin, they found a car covered in rust. With great effort, the villagers lifted the fabric and stood stunned in shock. The license plate of the old Volkswagen bore familiar numbers, those of Wolf and Martha Schmidt, a couple who went missing 17 years earlier. Inside the car were their belongings, suitcases with clothes, passports, a camera. The frightened people looked at each other. They all had the same question. How did this car end up in the garage of their quiet and pious cleric? In April 1985, the village was going about its usual business. Wolf and Martha, a young couple, were on their way to Wolf's cousin's wedding in a neighboring village. It was a short trip, only half an hour's drive, along an empty country road. The weather was sunny, and the couple was happy and full of anticipation. They were last seen at a local cafe where they stopped for a few minutes to drink coffee and buy a bottle of wine as a gift. When Wolf and Martha did not show up at the wedding, their relatives became concerned, but at first they attributed it to minor problems. A day passed, then another, but there was no sign of the couple. The authorities launched an extensive search: forests, fields, roads, rivers, all to no avail. The car went missing without a trace, just like its passengers. It seemed as if the couple had simply disappeared without a trace, the villagers speculated. Some blamed criminals for the disappearance. Others suspected that the couple had secretly fled due to family quarrels. However, there were no facts. Life gradually returned to normal. But Father Robert, the local priest, seemed strangely agitated and nervous. He often avoided talking about the missing couple, changing the subject to prayer and repentance. At the time, it felt expected, as he was a spiritual man. Over the years, memories of the Schmidts faded, and the priest continued to serve in his small church, always ready to comfort and help the villagers. No one could have imagined that such a respected man was hiding a dark secret. When the villagers found the car in the garage, the news spread instantly. Soon, police, reporters, and curious onlookers gathered at the old priest's house. More questions arose. Why did Father Robert keep the car? Why did he hide that he was related to Wolf Schmidt, even if only distantly? Why had he kept silent for so many years? The police began an investigation. Diaries and letters were found in the old priest's house, shedding light on the events of those years. It turned out that Father Robert was strongly bonded to his family, especially to Wolf, and his behavior over the past 17 years was far from as impeccable as it had seemed. Gradually, dark secrets began to surface, and the entire village was gripped by fear and curiosity about what else their seemingly righteous priest might be hiding. Investigators conducted a thorough search of the Schmidt couple's car and personal belongings. They found no obvious signs of a struggle or violence in the car. The personal belongings were neatly arranged, as if Wolf and Martha were planning to return in a few minutes. Only slightly crumpled passport pages and time-worn pictures bore witness to the passing years. The police began questioning local residents. People willingly shared their memories, but no one could say anything specific. Their recollections boiled down to general phrases: a nice couple, nothing suspicious. They disappeared suddenly, but the deeper the investigators dug, the clearer it became that Father Robert was involved in the disappearance of his relatives. Robert's diaries, found and written in cramped script, attracted attention. The entries began long before the couple's disappearance and continued until the last days of his life. In the first lines, investigators found nothing suspicious, only references to church services, notes about rural life, and brief reflections on faith and morality. But closer to April 1985, the tone changed dramatically. Robert described his excitement before the wedding of Wolf's cousin. He disapproved of the marriage, believing that the family was not suitable for their lineage. He felt he had to do something to prevent Wolf and Martha from participating in this inappropriate event. The entries became growing more distressed and fragmented, as if Robert was struggling with his own thoughts and feelings. The day before the couple disappeared, Robert wrote, "I must stop them. God is my witness. I will not harm them, but I cannot allow this to happen." Then the diary was interrupted for several days. The next entry was short and mysterious. "Now they are safe. No one will find them. God will forgive me, for I acted for the good of the family." These lines proved to be a turning point in the investigation. Investigators realized that they were not dealing with a simple crime, but with something more complex and incomprehensible linked to the priest's inner beliefs. But the main question were left unresolved. Where had the couple gone, and what had become of them? Soon, the police discovered other strange details. In the basement of Robert's house, they found several old suitcases with the couple's clothes. The clothes were clean and neatly folded, but a barely visible drop of blood was found on one of Wolf's shirts. An examination confirmed that the blood belonged to Wolf Schmidt. Questions were mounting, but there were still no answers. Meanwhile, tension was growing among the villagers. They couldn't believe that a man they had trusted with their secrets could have done such a thing. The residents began to recall small details from Robert's life that had previously seemed insignificant. His strange nighttime walks, his refusal to let people into the garage and basement, his insistent calls for prayer and repentance. All of this now took on a new, sinister meaning. Meanwhile, the police continued to search the priest's property and home, trying to find even the slightest clue that might reveal insights into the fate of the missing Schmidt couple. However, each new discovery only further muddled the case, making the mystery of their disappearance even more grim and sinister. The police turned their attention to a small wooded area behind the church, which Father Robert had owned since the 1970s. Investigators began to notice that local residents avoided the place, considering it unlucky. The dogs brought in by the police nervously circled a small shed at the edge of the forest, as if sensing something disturbing and frightening. Inside the building, they found old tools and garden equipment, covered with a thick layer of dust. At first glance, there was nothing suspicious, but one of the investigators noticed that the floor of the shed had recently been replaced with new boards. When the boards were removed, the police saw a fresh layer of earth, clearly compacted and recently dug up. They began to dig carefully, inch by inch. At a depth of about a meter, they found a small metal box locked with a padlock. When they opened it, they found letters and old photographs that Robert had carefully hidden for many years. Among the letters was a letter from Wolf to Robert, written several months before his disappearance. In it, Wolf asked his relative for advice and support in family matters. He talked about quarrels with his parents over his cousin's upcoming marriage and his desire to stay out of family conflicts. Wolf wrote, "I want a peaceful life. I just want to be happy with Martha, without this constant hostility." Robert's reply contained harsh words about duty to the family and a call not to betray it for the sake of personal happiness. Investigators gradually began to realize that the disappearance of the Schmidt couple was not a simple accident. Robert considered himself responsible for the purity of his family line and did not want to allow what he considered wrong. However, no letters or photographs could tell the whole story. Meanwhile, talk of the old barn behind the church began to spread throughout the village, filling the residents with anxiety. Many feared that Robert might be hiding other terrible secrets. The older residents recalled strange sounds and lights that they sometimes saw at night, coming from Robert's property. At the time, They had dismissed it as superstition. But now every rustle seemed ominous. The police began to comb the area even more thoroughly, bringing in more and more people to help with the search. On the third day, in the farthest part of the forest, among the thick undergrowth, investigators discovered an old well almost completely hidden by bushes. The well had not been used for a long time. The stones were covered with moss, and an unpleasant smell of dampness and decay emanated from it. Climbing down, the rescuers found human remains neatly stacked at the bottom and wrapped in cloth. An examination soon confirmed that they belonged to the missing couple. Apparently, the couple had been killed on the day of their disappearance, and their bodies hidden in this forgotten well. Now it was clear. Father Robert had been hiding the murder for years and deceiving the entire village, maintaining the appearance of a righteous and kind man. The shock of this discovery was so great that the villagers stopped trusting each other. It seemed that no one could be sure of the integrity of their neighbors and friends anymore. However, the biggest shock came from the motive for the crime revealed in one of Robert's last diary entries found later. "I didn't want them dead," wrote the priest, "but they didn't listen to me. I had to stop this sin at any cost. God will forgive me for this act, because I did it for the sake of my family." With the murder revealed, the entire village was gripped by panic and mistrust. Residents tried to understand how they could have lived next to a murderer for so many years and not noticed. Meanwhile, the police continued to study Robert's documents and records to piece together a complete picture of what had happened. In his diaries, Robert admitted that he had planned the conversation with Wolf and Martha in advance. He decided to meet them on the road, leading to the neighboring village, and convince them to cancel their trip to the wedding. The priest believed that this would protect the family honor from an inappropriate relationship. However, things did not go as he had planned. Robert wrote that the conversation quickly escalated into a conflict. Wolf and Martha categorically refused to return home and did not listen to the priest's pleas. In his diary, he described that day. "I couldn't convince them. Wolf was angry. Martha was crying. I didn't want to resort to violence, but they left me no choice." He described how, overcome with despair and anger, he struck Wolf with a heavy object he found on the road. Martha screamed and rushed to his aid. Robert, in a panic, struck a second blow. Realizing what he had done, he felt terrified. But instead of confessing to the crime, the priest decided to cover it up. Robert put the bodies in his car and drove it to a garage, hiding it where no one could see it. Then, during the night, he moved the bodies to an old well deep in the forest and carefully covered it with branches and bushes. He believed that in time, God would forgive him for his crime, because he believed he had acted for the greater good of his family. In his diaries, Robert described in detail his emotional conflict and fear of being exposed. Every day he prayed, hoping that his secret would remain hidden forever. Over time, he managed to convince himself that he had done the right thing and justified his actions by constantly repeating that it was God's will. The investigation was soon completed, and the case was handed over to the prosecutor's office. The village was no longer a calm and serene village. The residents could not shake the feeling of betrayal and fear. The events that had taken place 17 years ago cast a shadow over their entire lives, forcing them to rethink their attitudes toward faith and trust. The story soon became known far beyond the village, causing a nationwide shock. People discussed what had happened, amazed at how a deeply respected priest could have committed such a crime and lived peacefully among his parishioners for so many years, maintaining absolute composure. Although the case was officially closed, many questions were left unresolved, the villagers continued to live in the shadow of this tragedy. Unable to forget what had happened, they kept asking themselves, what could have possibly driven a man who had dedicated his life to serving God to commit such a terrible act? And could anyone be trusted completely? Now, after the investigation was completed and the expert reports confirmed Robert's guilt, an uneasy silence fell over the village. Residents avoided discussing what had happened openly, but everyone felt a chill at the thought that a murderer had lived among them for many years, skillfully pretending to be a man of virtue. Nowadays, you'd hardly ever see anyone in the church square. People preferred to pray at home, avoiding the old church, which had become a symbol of betrayal and pain. Many said it would be better to tear down the building to erase the memory of the tragedy, but no decision was ever made. Soon, one detail that had long gone unnoticed caught the attention of the police. During a further search of Robert's house, a secret niche was found behind a bookshelf in his study. Inside was an old leather notebook written by the priest long before the murder. The notes contained strange reflections revealing his deep inner doubts and contradictions. It turned out that in his youth, Robert had experienced serious trauma related to family conflicts. The family he grew up in was very strict and religious. He had a harsh understanding of morality and believed that he alone should control the fate of his loved ones. Over the years, this belief turned into fixation. Robert's attitude toward marriage was particularly painful. He believed that failed family unions destroyed the purity of the blood. His beliefs gradually took on the character of a pathological obsession. This was the reason for the fateful day in April 1985. Reading the last pages of his notes, the police realized that Robert felt neither regret nor remorse. In his last written note, he dryly summed up, "I have fulfilled my duty to God and my family. The rest is unimportant." After that, the village gradually began to recover, trying to forget this terrible story. But the shadow of those events remained forever in the memory of the residents. No one could look at their neighbors the same way as before. Suspicion and distrust became a permanent part of their lives. A few years later, the old church was closed and then completely demolished. In its place, the residents built a small park, as if trying to drown out the dark memories with bright changes. But even many years later, walking through this park, the elderly quietly recalled the horror that had disturbed their small world, and thought about how easily a person can hide the deepest shadows within behind a smile. The residents avoided the place where the old well had been found. The forest had completely engulfed it, and only occasionally did someone say that they had heard strange noises or seen vague shadows among the trees. However, no one wanted to check the truth of these stories, leaving the past alone and hoping that nothing like that would ever happen again. Calm slowly returned to the village, although no one could call it the same anymore. People tried to move on, realizing that the world is full of mysteries that are sometimes better left unsolved.